listen-only mode.
Hello. Welcome to the ALCTS Webinar, Creating Effective Webinars. I'm Felicity Dykes, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Maurice Coleman and Jill Hurst-Wahl. Maurice is the technical trainer at a Hartford County Public Library in Maryland. He's made numerous presentations on social media, technology implementation, and presentation and training skills. In addition, he hosts the library training and presentation podcast, T is for Training. Jill teaches at Syracuse University's School of Information Studies and is a contributor to the T for Training podcast. She's also a frequent conference presenter. She presented at Computers and Libraries, the Special Libraries Association Annual Conference, and Academic Library Conference in New York State, among some of them. Jill and Maurice bring a lot of experience to today's topic, and I think we're going to have lots of fun as we learn to give better presentations. So a few things to keep in mind for today's webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode. So if you have questions for Maurice and Jill, please type them into the question box. We're going to answer most of those at the end of the presentation. We don't have interactive chat capabilities, but ALCTS does have a Twitter account. So that hashtag is on the screen, ALCTSCE. So if you want to, go ahead and make comments there. But we don't monitor that, so yeah, do use that question box for questions and comments. We are recording the webinar, and all will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and the handout following the webinar. And now, here are Jill and Maurice. There'll be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Okay, let us get this thing up and rolling. There we are. Excellent. Hi, I'm Maurice Coleman, and with me today is
Jill Hurst-Wahl.
And you are watching Creative Effective Webinars. And thank you, ALCTS, I hope I pronounced that right, for asking Jill and us to do this class today. So here we are, your guides to the world of online presentations. Jill, why don't you tell them a little bit about your training background?
Sure. So again, this is Jill Hurst-Wahl. I've been training for a very long time. My training experience starts as a IT trainer doing face-to-face training in the mid-1980s, moving on to doing library training sessions. I've done webinars. I do semester-long classes, university classes, and some of those are online. And so even though this is a webinar about giving webinars, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are things that have been appropriate for me in an online classroom. Maurice?
And I have been training a slightly shorter amount of time than Jill. I like to tell people with the upcoming election, it'll be my 4th president I've been doing training under. I started in the early 1990s doing community organizing and internet training, and have been doing webinars, face-to-face classes, specialized things, all sorts of training opportunities throughout the last 20 years of my career, the last few years of my career.
So today you're going to notice that we're using a lot of images in this presentation. All of the images that we're using have a Creative Commons license on them. A tip for you is as you're doing webinars and other types of presentations, you may look for images to incorporate in them. Look for things that are Creative Commons licensed because they're available for you to use without seeking permission. Also, one of the things I do is I take a lot of photos, and I find ways of incorporating those photos into my presentations, webinars, and class sessions. So if you're going to be doing training, think about what images you might want to have and start taking those photos.
So another best practice in doing any type of class, presentation, etc., is to manage expectations. So this is what we're going to discuss today. The first bit about lingo, and discuss with the folks that you're teaching, learning, etc., because it really is an exchange. Discuss what you're expecting to present to them this day. So you should learn a little bit about some presentation lingo. We're going to talk a bit about what you do before your presentation, during your presentation, obviously a very important part. Also a part that is somewhat neglected, the aftercare after the presentation, and then some resources. And in this case, we're doing an agenda, as you would see usually with a bullet point, but this time we're doing it with some images that you will see repeated throughout in order to let people see the thematic progression of today.
And one of the resources I want to point out to you is that there is a handout for this webinar. If you look on your screen and you look in that kind of dashboard area, maybe on the right of your screen, there's something called Handouts. This is a 2-page handout that we've constructed for you to help you kind of think about what you're learning today, and also a place for you to note questions. If you haven't printed out that handout, that's okay. Maybe just pull it up in the background and flip to it every once in a while. It might help you in your note-taking that you're doing someplace else, and maybe a place where later on you compile some lasting notes for you as you think about giving webinars.
So here's another best practice. Here is a transitional slide. What you want is the person who's watching the webinar or listening to the webinar live to be able to, again, manage expectations. This is so you can gear up for what's coming next. And in our case, we're going to talk a bit about some presentation lingo that you just need to know in order to better present webinars or figure out whether or not you want to do webinars, or just to figure out online learning in general.
So when you think about giving a webinar, there's 2 types of webinars you can give. There's asynchronous and synchronous. You probably know what these words are, but let me just define them briefly. Synchronous is what's happening today. This is live. There's a synchronous generally means a back and forth of some type. In this case, it's a back and forth between Maurice and I and the other people, other organizers of this webinar. You can ask questions. There's a question box, so that's your live interaction. And so this is a synchronous webinar. Asynchronous is when the webinar is given with you only in listen-only mode, and it's not live. It's a recording that has been done, and there you are just listening to it on your own time. When you give a webinar, you want to know, is it going to be live, synchronous, you know, that kind of live back and forth, or is it something that you're going to record and people are going to listen to later?
So let's talk a little bit about delivery platforms and how these things happen. The first is we're going to talk about our delivery platforms for synchronous or live recordings. Here are the biggies. Of course, we are using the one in the upper left-hand corner, GoToMeeting. There's also Blackboard and Google Hangouts and WebEx. All of the programs do some, most, all of these things. You can share information as a presenter. You can obviously speak to your audience. You can chat with your audience. You can record the seminar sessions so that at a later time it becomes an asynchronous learning event. You can also, in some, push content, and sometimes there's a camera involved. Now, knowing the capabilities of what particular platform you are using is important in terms of design of your workshop. You will either add, subtract, do different things depending on what the learners can do. And they all have their idiosyncrasies, all of them. Also, when you are using something that's unfamiliar to you and you're about to do some sort of session in that particular thing, do a quick web search for a tip sheet for the particular asynchronous platform that you are using for your thing. Now, for you all as the students, sometimes depending on the platform you get to speak directly, depends on the size of the class. Right now we have approximately 115 attendees. That'd be a heck of a lot of speaking, and we only have an hour. There's also the capability of doing breakout sessions, meaning going into separate rooms, discussing things, and coming back to the group. You can raise your hand or vote on various things. There's also polling. You can do live writing right on the screen and provide either textual feedback, text feedback, or some sort of physical feedback, as in raising a hand, marking an area, etc. It is very different depending on the platform. So now that we talked a little bit about that synchronous learning, let's talk a little bit about asynchronous or recorded things. While you can use all of the things we just talked about to develop asynchronous things, there are some products out there that specifically deal with asynchronous recording modules. And usually when you're dealing with some sort of asynchronous learning, you are then moving into a learning management system, LMS. And these are some LMSs out there. I'm sure some of you have used Canvas, Saba, SharePoint, Moodle, or WordPress can even be an LMS. They all can track the progress of your particular learners. They usually host pre-recorded content. You can link them directly to content. You can have chat threads, and there are all sorts of extras that each of them happen to have. The infrastructure for your learning event is provided by that LMS. And sometimes you have to really wonder here with the asynchronous thing, how do you keep the learner engaged if you're not talking directly to them? How do you know that they're doing the work? That's part of the background work of the LMS. What motivates a person to even listen or to watch the entire webinar? Sometimes you have to think about your design in order to encourage that person to continue listening to your webinar.
Now, Maurice, we should note that a live webinar can be recorded just like this webinar is being recorded. So it's a synchronous webinar that some people will listen to asynchronously.
That is correct. So if you're listening to this after August 17th, 2016 at 1 p.m. Central Time or 1 something Central Time, you are listening to this as an asynchronous learning event. Thank you, Jill.
You're welcome.
The last bit is screencasting, which is a way of capturing information. Sometimes you'll do this for a learning event / webinar. These are 4 different products that do screencasting, meaning if you have to demonstrate how to use a particular piece of software, these are great things to help you demonstrate that visually, and you add audio, etc. to it. Adobe Presenter, Snagit, and Camtasia are some of the products that do that, and you may use this as a development platform for your particular web learning, webinar learning event.
So something we haven't mentioned is that webinars can be of any length of time. And so a screencast might be relatively short. It really depends on what you're trying to do. Webinars can be short because what are you trying to communicate? Is it something that really needs an hour? Does it need 15 minutes? And so that's part of what you have to think about in your development, and then that might impact what tool you use. So here, this slide is about adult learning theory. Malcolm Knowles is the person who coined the phrase andragogy as being synonymous with adult education. What we're really getting at, besides, multiple syllable words, is that adults learn differently than children. Adults want to learn practical skills. They want to learn things that will make their life and their work better. They want information to be delivered that they can immediately or fairly quickly put into practice. And so when you're developing your webinar, no matter what format, think about what you want the learners to do afterwards. What do you want them to put into practice? And make sure that that's obvious in your webinar. That may mean not focusing solely on theory, but also focusing on the hands-on or whatever practice that might be involved.
Also, a very important thing when you are doing a presentation, as my computer gets stuck. There we go. All right, you should see a new slide. There we go.
Yes.
Is to make sure that you have assistants doing whatever you're doing. You heard from some of our folks who are helping us produce this particular learning opportunity. It really is a collaboration between the student, the presenter, and the producer. The presenter and the producer are both vital to the learner's success. A producer helps the learner by troubleshooting tech issues that can get in the way of the learner experience without interrupting the presenter and the rest of the folks in the learning experience. And for me and for Jill as a presenter, the producer is able to take care of you as learners so that we can concentrate on the presentation. It's our job to do a great presentation. The producer greases the wheels for that. So this is our moment to use that question tab on your dashboard and perhaps throw in some questions about what we just talked about. Give you a couple of seconds to think about maybe your question that you have that we will take care of at the end of this learning opportunity. So your presentation will start well before your actual webinar. It truly begins when you propose the webinar and then begin to attend to all of the details. So here are some things that Jill and I truly believe that you need to notice and deal with before you give your presentation. The very first thing you should wonder about is, why am I talking? What are you trying to deliver to your audience? Why are you trying to deliver it to your audience? If you can't answer these questions, then maybe you really don't need to give a presentation. The answer should be your topic sentence for your presentation. And yes, there is really a topic sentence for your presentation. Our topic sentence is, we would like to teach you in an hour some very basic tips to create great webinars. That's our topic sentence. So now that you know why you're talking, you should really know, who are you going to be talking to? Who are they? Are they new to the subject? Are they subject matter experts? That will determine whether or not you go puddle deep or do a deep dive into a particular subject. Why are they taking your webinar? What's their motivation? What do they really need to know that you can convey to them in time that you're able to convey it? Can the webinar person provide this information, the producer provide some of this information to you beforehand? Or do you want to do a poll at the start? That's going back to knowing what the capabilities of a particular piece of software are. And are you willing to modify, and can you modify your webinar on the fly in case you realize your audience has either a deeper understanding of the topic or a more superficial understanding of your topic? Change your webinar on the fly.
A great practice is to create learning objectives for your webinar or for your training session, and so that why am I talking can lead you to create meaningful learning objectives that help your organizer and help your audience. It also helps your audience and your thinking to know how much time you have. So in this case, we were told you have an hour. Oh, you have X number of minutes plus time for questions. So what is the time that you have? How much time do you need? That's going to alter perhaps how much you cover, how deep you go into the topic. It might alter the interaction that you use. So know how much time you have. If that becomes a negotiating point, maybe you negotiate for additional time or less time. Depends on what you feel the need is and what your webinar organizer feels the need is. Now, Maurice and I are partnering today on this webinar. And what you don't know is that Maurice and I have known each other for a number of years. And we work together on a podcast nearly twice a month and been doing that for 8 years, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, so we know each other really well, and we can partner together really well. Do you want to partner with someone on your webinar? Does that make your webinar stronger? If you are going to partner with that person, then how are you going to do it? How are you going to divide the time? How are you going to do the interaction? Can you cooperate on how everything is structured? Do you need to give a little on your expectations in how you do things? For example, Maurice and I use our slides differently. That's because in how we work on a day-to-day basis. I work in the classroom. Maurice works doing shorter things with a different audience than I do. And so how we use our slides is a bit different. That means that as we approach this webinar, we had to decide what we were going to do. Come to a happy medium, if you will. And so if you're going to partner, you need to solve those things up front. The sooner you can solve them, the better off you will be. Really be intentional if you're going to partner with someone else about all those details. Now, in partnership, also with your webinar host, you have some sort of a contract or an agreement. Know what your webinar host wants you to do. Have an agreement with them. Now, this doesn't have to be a formal contract. This can be a series of emails, but know up front what their expectations are, and this can be critically important. What do they expect you to do? When do they expect you to do it? Are there specific things that they expect you to deliver? Are there specific things that they expect during the webinar itself? And if you're partnering with someone else, have an agreement, again, perhaps a series of emails that state what your expectations are with that person. How are you going to divide the time? How are you going to work together? Have something that you can point back to. This really is a cover your ass type move, and a move that's really important. Part of that agreement is recognizing that your content is your content. Now, this is important to me, especially because of teaching. I teach about copyright law and licenses, and so I recognize that my content truly is my content. As you're working on a webinar, working with a partner, working with a webinar host, make sure it's clear that your content is yours. That after the webinar is over, yes, you're giving them rights to use that material in the webinar, perhaps in the recording on an ongoing basis, but you can reuse your stuff. And if that's not clear, either in writing or through conversation, make sure that you're comfortable with whatever is going on, because it's important that you own your own stuff. So in terms of setup, what you don't know is I'm sitting in the hotel room this week, and so my setup is not what I would normally have. I'm on Wi-Fi in a hotel whose Wi-Fi I knew nothing about until I got here on Saturday night. I actually hauled with me my headset, an extension cord in case I needed it. Normally I would be in my office at school or at home where my setup is, I know, is stable. I'm in a situation where my setup might not be as stable as I want. So knowing your setup is important. Having the right equipment is important. I truly believe in having a headset and not depending on the microphone in my computer. I think the sound quality is a lot better with a headset, and again, hearing what's going on because I'm wearing a headset is also much better. Maurice, what about your setup?
Well, I'm sitting in my home office. I have a direct wired connection to my router, so it's a relatively stable connection. I also have a headset and microphone. I have a light right over my slides. I have a set, since you're looking at my computer, I usually use the time on the computer. I have a watch here with an approximate time so that I know where we are in the course. I have an extra phone here, my landline, well, quote-unquote landline. I have my cell phone downstairs in case I need that. I have water. I have my computer, more importantly, to set up. If you are using any particular platform, always make sure your computer is compatible with your particular platform. I've run into issues with presenters that their computer isn't quite up to snuff to deal with the particular platform that we were using for a class. Also, make sure that your background isn't distracting, that you have lots of things going on, close a door, etc. And make sure that you, for part of your setup, is that you test everything. Make sure it all works, as we did last week with the folks from ALCTS. And here's another sort of very basic tip. Take care of your personal needs right before you start. That way you're not rushing or anything else, because you might take care of a personal need right before you start. That is part of your setup and part of your preparation for the course.
Another good thing is to close down things on your computer that you don't need to have open. The less work your computer is doing, the better your computer will handle the webinar software. And you really want the webinar to go off without a hitch. And so be mindful about not only your distractions, but your computer's distractions.
And tell your family, I'm doing it from home, tell your family that you're working, that you're not just tooling around watching the Olympics on on NBC, that you're really working, so that they don't come in, younger people come in and try to dive bomb you or anything else. And that really goes towards our next thing we want to talk about, which is to try to eliminate distractions. All that setup, all that prep is an effort to eliminate distractions from you, the presenter. And really, you hope that at some point the attendees will also eliminate the distractions, but turning off your email, turning off all the things that are not absolutely essential to you delivering your presentation is essential. Distractions, so, you can get easily distracted by various things.
So I want to use this slide to point out something really kind of jumping way ahead in our webinar content, is that sometimes things don't go off as you test them, as you envision them, and so you'll notice that the top of the slide got cut off. That happens. You can't always anticipate how the webinar software is going to handle your slides, and so when that happens, just roll with it.
So
Really,
the very
actually have to
top
know what
says,
that
hello,
says.
it says, hello, my name is Cal, interrupting Cal, in
Yep.
case you figure that out from it being chopped off. And mind you, I went through, when we did our run through, I went through this about 6 times in the last week to see what slides would fit. And then today decides this doesn't fit. That happens.
So as we continue on, post questions in chat, in the question area. If you have comments that you just want to make to us, you can also put those in the question area. Kind of use that as your general purpose way of communicating with us. Thank you.
So let's talk, now that you've done all that prep, you signed your contracts, you've tried to eliminate the interrupting Cal, let's talk a bit about the actual presentation. Rule number 1, the very first thing I would like you all to remember, if you take absolutely nothing away from this particular hour, is that you, in fact, you, not the fancy slides, not a page of statistics, not pictures of your cats or your dogs. None of these are as important as you as a presenter. Whatever tool you are using, you have to remember that you are in fact the presentation. Your why, they've come to see you, come to your thing, have decided to take a break from the day in our case. Anything that takes away from that experience should be disposed of as soon as possible. Remember, you are in fact the presentation. So your presentation, now that you've done it, you should truly storyboard your presentation. If you're a visual person, feel free to draw small stick figures here. I come from a video production background, so I think storyboard. I put words and ideas that I want to use in the particular presentation. I put those up either physically on index cards or digitally on a slide deck producing software. Put those individual things on individual slides, move them around, see which way it makes sense. And it's a great way to organize your thoughts and also to put your thoughts in a continuous brainstormish type activity. This is what I want to talk about. Oh, wait, let me remember to put this in, and that in, and that in, and this in. Then you can reorganize them and take out what you need for a successful workshop.
As you're designing your webinar, think about the conversation tools that you want to include. So how do you want people to interact with you? How do you want them to interact with you during your presentation? Do you want them to do chat? Do you want to have interaction before the presentation actually starts, maybe through Twitter? Do you want to have interaction with people after the webinar is over? Again, Twitter, maybe some other social media tool, maybe just comments on the webinar's webpage. Do you want to allow people to do follow-up with you? And if yes, again, how do you want to handle that engagement? So remember that you have software that you're giving the webinar in. Talk to your webinar host ahead of time about what interactive tools they allow. Not every version of GoToMeeting, for example, is used the same way. Some people will limit the tools that you have available to you, so know what those are before you construct your webinar. If you decide that you're going to limit that live interaction, is there something that you want your participants to do that keeps them engaged? Because that's what this interaction is really for. It's a way to engage people. And so one way of doing that is through note-taking, through maybe some activity you have people do. This slide has some specific elements in it that many of the software do have. Again, if you are allowed to do that kind of live interaction, hand raising is great. Voting can be great. Voting can be a great way of just testing the audience up front, testing their knowledge. You might have people simultaneously writing on a whiteboard in the software. Adobe Connect is great for doing breakout sessions, and it will easily do breakout sessions. However, here's an important tip for interactive tools. They take time. They will take more time than you think. So if you're going to build in interaction and you think it's going to take you 5 minutes, it's probably going to take you 10 or 15 minutes. So that may limit how much interaction you really want to have, you really do, because interaction takes time.
So let's talk a little bit now that you figure out what tools you're going to use to interact with people. You realize that you're the presentation and you're storyboarded. Now you're going to create the visual tool to help get your message across, get the why am I talking across to your folks. So here are some essential tips to help you do that. The very first thing, you need to think visually, not text. You need to think visual. The printed word is a very, very powerful tool. In a learning session, however, visuals can have a lasting impact on learners. I've been in sessions where folks forgot what I was talking about, but remembered a particular impact thing, the visual, and that helped them say, oh, yes, that helps me trigger what you were talking about. Using that visual will help more of your learners understand what are you trying to convey with your particular talk. So always the next question I get when I teach people about creating workshops is, so PowerPoint is evil, isn't it? Well, here's the thing. You have PowerPoint that you can use to create things. There's Keynote for the Mac. There are Google Slides if you are using some sort of web-based product as we did for this, or OpenOffice Presenter. You see, the tool is just a tool. It just doesn't matter what tool you use. It truly doesn't. That is because an ugly slide is an ugly slide in any program. You can make ugly slides in Keynote. You can make ugly slides in Google Slides. You can make ugly slides anywhere. It doesn't matter. This is an example of an ugly slide. This is an actual slide from an actual presentation about Android application development. I bet you are either trying to read every single little thing on that screen and then thinking, wow, I can't follow this in any way, shape, or form. This doesn't make a single bit of sense. And it also distracts you. This type of slide will distract you from the presenter. Because remember, you are the presentation. You don't want anything like this distracting you from anything. So here are some 4 tips on developing your slides. You follow these tips plus using some of the other resources that we're going to present to you towards the end of today, you will have pretty dang good slides all the time. My very first tip for you is to remember big is better than small. It's always better to go big or go home than to go too small. Or remember, I want impact with my big idea versus your little itty bitty idea on the slide. I want you impact. I want you to focus on a particular thing. As a presenter, if I put text on a slide, I want you to focus on that. That is the topic sentence of what I'm talking about. I want you to focus on that, not the individual little details, such as that little life cycle slide that I just showed you. In terms of design and in terms of fonts, very simple words for you. Keep it KISS, keep it sans serif. You may ask yourself, what does sans serif mean? Well, here is a handy dandy little definition. It's those wacky tobacco lines you see at the edge of things, rounded things, the main stroke of a letter at the top or the bottom of a particular letter in a particular font. For example, that M is Times New Roman. Times New Roman shouldn't be in any presentation at all. In fact, Jill, if you can you relate to folks what happened to you at your school just the other day?
Oh, so why don't you flip to the next slide?
Oh, that's a good idea. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things I'm learning about and others in my school are learning about is how to meet the needs of someone with visual impairments. And what we learned is that sans serif, like at the bottom of this slide, is better for people with visual impairments. Those fonts above that have those cute little lines or they're kind of funky like the Broadway font are not good for people with visual impairments. If they can read text, they may have a harder time reading those texts. If they're using a screen reader, the screen readers are going to have a hard time with those 5 things at the top. So sans serif or serif is the best way to go for people with visual impairments. And you want to meet the needs of everyone in your audience.
Plus, I can speak for me, that if I see these particular fonts in a large size, after a while, my head begins to hurt. I get a headache. That's not good. You don't want people walking out of your thing with a headache because they couldn't look at your slides. You want them to walk out with a headache because there's so much information that you've given them that their heads are about to explode. You see, that is good. My eyes hurting, not good.
So Maurice is passionate about this, which is why I'm not letting him talk on this slide. Your slides are not your handout. And you'll notice today that the handout we gave you is a 2-page handout. We've got like 60 slides. So we didn't want our slides to be the handout. And if you look at our slides, they wouldn't make a good handout for you. Your slides are not your handout. Your slides are what you're presenting. They're your guide for your presentation. If you need a handout, create a separate handout, which we've done as a best practice in this presentation. So your slides should be readable. They should be not too many words. They should be visually appealing. Your slides are your guide. They keep you on track. They are not your script exactly, but they do structure you, the presenter. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about slides, just for 30 seconds. Guy Kawasaki, years ago, did a blog post about the 10-20-30 rule of PowerPoint. And it's something that I use in my presentations. First of all, he believes that the smallest font you should use is 30. Sometimes that's a little difficult depending on your format, but 30. You want those letters to be visible if you're face-to-face by the person in the back of the room. If it's a webinar, you don't want people to have to get their nose up next to the screen. So have a good size font. The 20 is a length of presentation. And so his thing was that, presentation should be 20 minutes. Now, gear it for 20 minutes, but they often run longer for a variety of different reasons. And in that 20 minutes, he felt you should only have 10 slides. So I use this as a guide. If I'm doing a 20-minute presentation, I generally have 10 to 12 slides. If I'm doing a 40-minute presentation, that's 20 to 25 slides or something like that. But it helps me to kind of gear what I'm doing and structure what I'm doing. So it's a different way of using my slides as a guide for my presentation. Again, Maurice believes in more image slides. He also uses slides a bit more differently, and when you're partnering with someone, you have to make sure that you understand what you're going to do and that you agree. So
Absolutely.
we just want to note for a second that you can ask questions in that window for questions. Again, if you have comments that you want us to focus on later, you can put comments in there also. So the next area is delivery. And I just want to note that you need to practice. And if, Maurice, if you flip to the next slide, please. Practice your presentation, practice it several times, practice it in your head. We both have our presentations printed out, flip through it, make notes, know what you want to say, know what you want to say when. Have your script in front of you. We have our presentations in front of us, so you can flip through. Have a backup plan for if things don't work well. Part of our backup plan is every place that we have a copy of this presentation. It's in email, it's on the internet, it's probably on a USB drive someplace. You know, have copies. If Maurice's computer goes down, I can pull up my copy and continue the webinar. Make sure that you've done whatever you can to ensure that things will continue. And then people think if you give presentations frequently that you don't get scared. But really, being scared, being a little nervous is okay. It keeps you focused. It ensures that you practice. It ensures that you pay attention to the details. And so if you're going to do a webinar, practice, 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 practice in front of people or in front of the dog or the cat. But if you still feel a little nervous, that's okay. That's actually a good thing. But hopefully it doesn't show in your voice. Maurice, you want to talk about tempo?
Sure. Tempo, you will have to make sure that your voice matches a simple tempo plus your tempo of your entire presentation. And sometimes a little bit of wiggle room, for example, but you have to make sure that your voice is audible. You have to make sure that folks can understand you, that they've caught up with you necessarily, because everyone is not on the exact same connection. You're not in a room with someone. You have about, let's see, there are 110 people on this call, so there are about 110 different ways folks are connecting to this seminar. So I try to stop myself and pace myself, let my voice catch up with things that you can hear what I'm saying. I also am speaking way slower than I do in a personal conversation. I'm originally from New York. I tend to talk, as Jill mentioned, faster than a New Yorker. I talk about as fast as a New Yorker now, but I don't do that during presentations because I want to make sure I reach everybody, that I don't want someone to wonder what the heck did he just say because he's already moved on to the next thing. My God, I don't know what's going on here. I'm done. There are 3 general rules of public speaking. Rule number 1, say what you're going to say. Number 2, say it. Number 3, say what you just said. In my experience, folks do not always listen to you all the time. So if you repeat your thing slightly or different variations, at some point they're going to catch it. So it's okay if you repeat yourself, because all folks are not using active listening skills throughout an entire web session.
So when you speak, we all tend in conversation to put in filler words like these words on the screen. When you give a presentation, when you give a webinar, especially when you give a webinar, do not say these words. Do not use filler words. It's much better to just close your mouth and pause for a second. Many, 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 many years ago, I had someone actually count the number of times I said in a presentation, and I can tell you that that made me stop doing it. So if you want to have someone count when you do these things. If that helps you, fine, but really just try not to say these. Also, on the next slide, don't use jargon. Assume that the people in your audience do not know your jargon. Even if you're speaking to people that should know the jargon, don't use it because you really don't know your audience in total. You haven't surveyed all of them, so eliminate all jargon. If you're using acronyms, say what the acronym is. Maurice?
And you should really make sure you tweak and practice to perfection. You won't ever reach perfection, but darn it, you're going to get very close. And the better your presentation, the more familiar you are with your presentation, the more likely you are able to deal with the unexpected thing. So I bet you this person's day was kind of ruined by losing all those cars. But truly, expect the unexpected, because at some point the unexpected will happen to you. You will suddenly lose a connection. You may lose a producer. You may have to leave suddenly. I had one course I was teaching that an earthquake happened at the very beginning. So there are all sorts of things that could happen to you during the course of your presentation. But the better you know your stuff, the better you know your presentation, the more able you are to be flexible. And the more you are able to make sure in your presentation design that you leave room for your computer to freeze up. There we go. Leave room for questions. Make sure you do leave room for some questions at the very end of your presentation.
And with that in mind, I want to talk about after your presentation, and I'm going to kind of roll through these slides. Your presentation doesn't stop at the end of the hour or the end of the 20 minutes or whatever that time length is. After your presentation is really a critical point for you. You need to celebrate. Yes, celebrate. Even that's a little happy dance. You should encourage follow-up at the end of the presentation with the people who were in the webinar. Encourage them to contact you. Now, sometimes the way I've done this is actually in the follow-up email to people. Maybe it's sending them the handout or whatever. I will say, hey, you can follow up with me. You can contact me for more information. So encourage follow-up. Take time to evaluate how you did. If you get an evaluation form from the webinar producer, look at it, or have someone look at it for you and tell you what it says. Sometimes that's a little bit easier on your ego. But look at the evaluation, think about what you should have done differently. Be easy on yourself. You probably did better than you thought, so don't be overly harsh, but do commit to getting better. So if that means taking a class, if that means practicing more, if whatever that means, commit to getting better because your friends want you to get better. Your webinar producers, the people who want to hire you for a webinar, want you to get better. And so finally, because I want to make sure that we can handle questions, I want to just point out that there are resources on the handout. There are 6 books listed on the handout, as well as a link to another webinar that Maurice and I did. The handout has the complete citations for these books. If you're unfamiliar with them, go into WorldCat or your own library catalog and look at them. So we have really covered 5 areas. You can see that here is a reminder of the areas that we've covered in this webinar. It's a nice practice at the end if you have time to kind of remind people of what you covered. Also, a good thing at the end, flipping ahead, is to thank people for coming, so thank you, and to give people your contact information. Remind them of who you are, because honestly, they may not remember, and tell them how to contact you. So here are our email addresses, and Maurice and I are extremely active on Twitter, and so feel free to tweet at us with questions or email us with questions.
All right, Jill, so I have popped out some of the questions, and let's see, here's a good one. Sometimes webinars are both synchronous and asynchronous. You plan to do a live webinar and then post for others to listen to later. I guess that was more of a comment. How do you determine which is the best software for your particular webinar?
So for me, it's what the producer is using. If I'm controlling my webinar, if I'm giving the webinar and I'm the producer, then I'm going to use what I'm comfortable with, and I can tell you that's actually Adobe Connect at this point in time. But oftentimes it's what that webinar producer is using. And so for this, it was GoToMeeting.
Yep, and you have to be as a presenter. If you do this for enough different groups, you tend to use a lot of, they're all kind of the same, it's just where they put everything. That's really the big thing. Here's another question from Francis. Do you explicitly state that you own your content when you set up a teaching event? If you work for an organization, does the organization own the content since you are working for hire?
How come I can't see those questions?
It's under the questions tab.
I know, but I don't see the questions. I don't see that question. So oftentimes in the contracts I've signed with people, and again, one-page contracts, there has been something about who owns the content. The fact that I have gotten permission for any images that I am using, that I'm not plagiarizing, and that the webinar producer recognizes that I own the content. If I think it's going to be a problem in talking to a webinar producer or a webinar group, I will bring it up in conversation about my content and how they expect to use it afterwards. So, but for me, that kind of, it's listening to what their expectations are and then asking questions and clarifying.
Okay. All right, and then there was a suggestion in the questionnaire from Natasha about that in her office they have a live webinar in progress sign, I assume they can put on the door. That helps because they're in a space where you can get through traffic during the day. That's a really good idea. Also, if you are in a cube farm, put up some caution tape behind you or put on the back of your chair, hey, I'm in a live learning event. That's as a participant and as a presenter, that you're not just, again, looking at Rio highlights for the day, because that's what I'd be doing right now, is looking at team handball.
Yeah.
Here's a really good question from Courtney Young. How do you balance great-looking images and text when preparing your slides?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I try to limit how much text I do have on my slides. I'm mindful, though, if I'm in the audience where there are non-English speakers, non-native English speakers, that I may have more text so that I'm giving them the clues that they need to understand what I'm talking about. I want to make sure that the text is clear, but also that the image supports the text. And so for me, it might be that there are some images, there might be some slides that have no images, but a limited amount of text. Sorry, that's not the best answer, but that's what I can do.
And really, I think, Jill, that's all part of knowing your audience. All right, and one last question, since we were getting from our producer that important third part of a triangle that we have 30 seconds left. Is there an example somewhere that of a speaker contract?
We can link you to one.
Okay. There you go.
We can put that out in Twitter or someplace else. There are speaker contracts. There's probably not a perfect one, but
Right.
there are some speaker contracts probably out on the internet that we can point to.
And really, truly, Francis, that's a great follow-up question. Just make sure that you say the magic words. The presenter is giving you limited rights to reuse the content. However, I retain my rights to the content itself.
Yep.
You want some language like that. It's always good to have a friend who has some law ability. And with that, I see we are at our we are at 3 o'clock, which means we have to stop talking. I think that's what that means.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Jill and Maurice. That was a lot of information. I really appreciate what you shared there.
Excellent.
And I want to thank both of you. Also, the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, especially Mary Reeder, who was our technical support and helped put this together, and Carrie Cassio from the ALCTS office. Let's see, I'm waiting for Mary to change.
Do I have to kick myself out?
I think.
All right, let's.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
Mary's out. All right, that works.
Switching it here. Okay.
Hey, it's good. You know, it's good to see some familiar faces. I keep seeing people pop up. I see folks that I've been lucky enough to work with, both with and not with Jill. It's really nice that some people showed up for this.
Yeah, we had a great audience. And let me remind all of you that this was the first in our fall series, so we have a lot of webinars coming up, including next week is on Survive, Thrive, and Boost Your Research Productivity. We have 2 sessions on Library of Congress classification, something on publishers' hidden content, which will be of interest to serial people, a faceted application of subject terminology. October, November will be of interest. 6 webinars on BibFrame and linked data. So kind of a future look of where we're going with our bibliographic data. Budget and research data management. So we have a variety of things we invite you to participate in. ALCTS also has web courses. Those are 4 to 6 week courses. And e-forums, one coming up on wrangling license agreements. So thank you all for attending. You will be getting an email soon with the recording to the presentation, handout, and slides.
And ALA TechSource is also doing a longer format presentation development course taught by a mutual friend of Jill and myself, Paul Signorelli. So if you're interested in that, feel free to take a look at that. And also, Jill and I are willing to talk to you afterwards. You have our contact information there at the very end, and it's great. Thank you very much, and have a great day, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.